When I asked you what kinds of weird Pokemon vocabulary you were interested in learning about, by far the most common request was Legendary versus Mythical. Today, in the final video of my series using Linguistics to analyze various aspects of the Pokemon games, we'll try to break down how those terms are and aren't working. This is video number 5, and if you haven't been watching every single entry of this series, you'll probably be just fine to keep watching this one, but the first 2 videos will give you a good foundation. Where do I even start? Because these 2 terms, Legendary and Mythical, their history is a little bit complicated. I guess we'll begin with now. Legendary and Mythical are used for 2 different groups of Pokemon. Legendary Pokemon, known in Japanese as Densetsu no Pokémon, literal translation, are usually very powerful Pokemon that you can only encounter once in each game. Mythical Pokemon, on the other hand, are Pokemon that you usually do not encounter in-game except through some kind of promotional distribution. The translation there is a little bit trickier because the Japanese term is Maboroshi no Pokémon, which means more illusory or phantom Pokemon.
You can really see why they chose them because, because Densetsu is, it's storied, right? It's the storied Pokemon, right? And Maboroshi is like phantom or illusory, right? The ones that don't actually exist.
This is Kara, resident linguist for this series.
And so like with legends, you're like, maybe legends are true, maybe they're not. Myths, you're like, no, they're all made up, right? Like, I think that's the kind of the distinction they were trying to make. In Wales, all of the adventures happen in France because France is the legendary country for Wales. France doesn't really exist. It's this fantasy place where fantasy things happen. And so you have that sort of relational thing. And it's funny in this because you do encounter legendary things, you're like, that they are real. And so you have to come up with a different quality, like a different way of interpreting that. That's pretty common for when you're thinking about living in a fantasy world, right? Where legends, you do meet legends. You can't just say, no, legends, they're just legends. Well, what happens when you're trying to consider these terms as how I would consider them in my world versus because legendary and mythical mean something kind of similar if we're only thinking about our world, they're both stories, right? Legends are stories and myths are stories. But if you think about like living in a world where legends might be true, but, myths are too far away to matter, right? They're too far in the past. You can reconceptualize those words by putting yourself in the world. It's also really funny because they have a very specific and clear meaning on the Doylean level, right? These are the ones that you will encounter, but they're rare, and these are the ones that are promotional. And something that is phantom or illusory as promotional works very well.
So that's part of where the confusion between these 2 terms comes from. The way that we use it, they have very similar meanings, but the franchise's marketing gives them very distinct meanings. But that's not the only confusing thing. It actually starts all the way back at the beginning of the series with the first generation of games. In the first couple of generations, in-game, legendary wasn't really a label. It was just an adjective used to describe Pokemon that were featured in Legends. In Generation 1, it was applied to Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, as well as Arcanine, which is a common Pokemon, but it was described as legendary in China. From Generation 2 to Generation 5, the term slowly gained its stricter, more modern meaning. We didn't have capital L legendary Pokemon until Generation 6. Interestingly, even though Mewtwo is classified as a legendary Pokemon for marketing and in-game code for the purposes of competitions and such, in-game, it has never been called legendary. As for mythical, you know what Pokemon it was applied to in Generation 1? It was Dratini, or Dragon-type Pokemon in general, but specifically applied to Dratini because until recently they were thought to be an illusion, or in English, a myth. Dragon-type Pokemon are rare, especially in Generations 1 and 2, but they are not legendary or mythical by the current definitions of those terms. In Generation 2, there's also a line referring to Lugia as a mythical sea creature, but that was only in English. The original Japanese phrase is Umi no Kami-sama, which just means God of the Sea. So even in-game, the uses of legendary and mythical were sort of interchangeable. They matched our colloquial use. And even the Pokemon Company didn't distinguish the two groups in Western language media. In Japan and Korea, mythical and legendary Pokemon were always considered two separate groups, but outside of that, mythical Pokemon were considered a subset of legendary Pokemon all the way through Generation 4. To give you some concrete examples, both Manaphy and Arceus were called legendary with a capital L in everything in marketing copy for their respective movies. And Mew, Darkrai, and Shaman have all been called legendary in their trophy descriptions in Super Smash Bros. Oddly enough, Mew and Shaman were called legendary in Super Smash Bros. For 3DS and Wii U, which was released in 2014, well into Generation 6, when the distinction between legendary and mythical Pokemon was already supposed to be strict. So if even the Pokemon Company themselves took more than 4 generations to figure out what they wanted to do with legendary and mythical Pokemon, how are we supposed to know what to call them?
It's something about growing up in your cultural context. And so, like, it makes sense that since we didn't grow up in the Pokemon context, we don't have that inherent knowledge, so you have to learn it from context. But because the context is so controlled by marketing and shifts in the games and things happening here and things happening there, you don't have that sort of reliable, that sense that you can build on a reliable word for it, right? A reliable denotation for these words. Corporations are really good at interfering with language learning processes, which is the trick here, I think. I actually wrote a paper once on blend words, right? How, like in shipping, when you take two characters' names and you mash them together, what are the linguistic principles of that? And like, if you just look at shipping and what becomes accepted, you can learn a lot about how English phonotactics work. What are the types of sounds and sound patterns that people like in English. But if you look at the set of corporate words where committees came up with those words, you can learn nothing because they are not accurate. They are just done there to try and create that sort of sense of an organic connection between these two words, but it's not there. When you use words in a community, you use them for certain reasons and they develop certain meanings based on the history of use and the context of use. When you have someone coming top down and saying, this is the word and this is what it means, and then they come down and say something else 5 minutes later, it's like, well, I don't know what that word means because I'm not being allowed to generate the meaning of it with my community.
So the distinction between legendary and mythical Pokemon was sort of botched by the Pokemon Company. As far as I was able to find out, the first in-game instance of using mythical in the modern sense was also in Generation 6, same as legendary. That means we had 5 full generations of the word mythical being used more as a synonym for legendary rather than as a distinction from it. So I feel like rather than using the term mythical, something like illusory might have worked better. The Japanese term maboroshi still works because it's different enough from densetsu, and the two groups were treated separately all along, so the chance of confusion is much smaller. In English, legendary and mythical don't feel like the best distinctive pair, but it's what we've got. They're not going to change it at this point.
One thing that I just, I feel like is really interesting about these types of things where you have a game and the game is building a world and the world has its own language to it, right? It always has its own language, which you learn by participating in the game. And so it does make it complicated when that language keeps changing on you and things are not consistent, and what you thought you knew turns out to be, false, but not in a scientific way where you are increasing your understanding of things and therefore changing your language to go along with that.
Thank you for watching this series. I really hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, maybe you can help me out by giving it a like, leaving a comment, and maybe even sharing the series with a friend. Thank you also to Nob Ogasawara, translator of the first 4 generations of Pokemon games, for giving me his perspective on many of the terms that I covered in this series. And to Kara for taking the time to talk with me and go through all of the terms that I was interested in. The series would not have been possible without you. And thank you also to my friend Sam, who introduced me to Kara. Finally, please help me thank all of the Libros who support this channel financially, especially luxury patron Ethan from Chicago. I'll see you in the next chapter.